So, welcome to the Grail Country. I have a special live stream today. I got together a group of Catholics. I tried to get some kind of political, ideological diversity in the panel here today to the best that I could. We're here to talk about Jordan Peterson's recent Twitter spat with the Pope, which started off with with him responding to a hashtag social justice quote that the Pope had put out. And then he kind of then later on doubled down. It's actually the second tweet that I found bothersome personally when he denied that authentic social justice was Christian. I thought that was probably a direction that conservatives don't want to go in. So I kind of wanted to, but I wanted to get, I'm an Anglican, so I wanted to get, but I have a lot of Catholic friends. And I wanted to get a Catholic perspective on this, and I wanted to get as many Catholic perspectives as I could. So I put together this collection of individuals today, and I'm kind of just going to go with the way you are on my screen to have you introduce yourselves. Larry, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Briefly, I'm Dr. Larry Chapp. You can drop the doctor. And I'm a retired professor of theology. I taught 20 years at DeSales University, which is near Allentown, Pennsylvania. And in 2013, I retired from teaching early at about age 55 to start a Catholic worker farm, which is northwest of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is what I am doing now. I also started a blog, gaudemutspes22.com. That's become somewhat popular, and that has kept me really, really busy of late. And also, since you're an Anglican, I'll say that even though I'm a cradle Catholic, I attend an Anglican ordinariate parish, simply because I love the liturgy. It's a beautiful liturgy. But anyway, that's who I am.
Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura. I was brought up Lutheran, and I joined the Catholic Church in college, and then was a very serious Catholic for a long time, but I crashed and burned in my mid-30s and was an atheist for some years, and then I found my way back to the church, and here I am.
Thank you, Laura. Jordan.
Yes, I'm Jordan Wood. I've become familiar with Dr. Chapp recently, and I basically just follow him anywhere he goes. So,
I'll tell you what, I've interviewed Jordan twice on my the blog, my video blog, and I've got nothing but grief for interviewing you, Jordan, from all of the rad trad saying you're a universalist now. How dare you, you heretic?
Yeah, well, I'm sorry about that. The shadows tend to cause problems, but yeah, no, that's anyway, I don't know. I'm a stay-at-home dad, really, is what I do most of the time. And I got a PhD in theology, and I wrote a book on St. Maximus the Confessor.
Hi, I'm Richard Ferrier, tutor at Thomas Aquinas College. And by the way, the Anglican liturgical tradition is beautiful. I came to Rome in part over women's ordination and the life questions, and in part because my students were praying behind my back. They enrolled me. I teach at Thomas Aquinas College. I've taught there now. This is my 45th year, and I teach all kinds of things. Now I'm doing Aristotle's Ethics and Politics, among other things. I've done the theology tutorial in the first 2 years. First year, it's all scripture. And I have a book called The Declaration of America at St. Augustine Press. They are the slowest outfit in the world when it comes to actually getting your book out. So I think you can order it. They'll tell you you have to wait a little bit. I have been involved in politics. I was chairman of my county Republican Party. I'll tell you some things about that if you care to know. It's a sort of a pro-life takeover of it, and I was drafted into it. I wound up being chairman. This is a long time ago. And I've been involved in the diversity wars for 30 plus years, resisting multiculturalism as an imposition on my college with respect to its curriculum, mostly, and other matters like that. And I was a co-chairman of the California Civil Rights Initiative, and that's another political thing, right? Which banned preferences on the basis of race, ethnicity, and sex in the California state government, contracting, and so forth. I guess I'm, if I am well, Larry says he's conservative too. I'm a kind of radical conservative too.
Mm.
I worked with Alan Keyes in his presidential primary campaigns. And I can tell you more, but let's get on.
All right. Thank you, Richard. So let me ask, let me just kind of just go around before we talk about the specific question of social justice from a Catholic perspective and what Peterson might have got right and what Peterson might have got wrong in his response to the Pope. If you could just go around and say what your general impression of Jordan Peterson is, prior to this.
Could I go first?
Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
Well, I have one thing to say. Nietzsche. Nietzsche is an extremely insightful, wonderful author, and you can learn an enormous amount from him. But he's like a pharmaceutical. He's not like a food. and that's kind of how I feel about Jordan Peterson. Lots of insight. Oh God, don't be a disciple of his. Something like that.
No, that's actually, Richard, that's actually very much aligns with what one of my fundamental critiques of him as well that I've made all along. Although I do find him to be some benefit, and he is helping some people. I do think that he's a Nietzschean at the end of the day.
Well, I wasn't quite saying that. I was saying he's like Nietzsche anyway.
Yeah,
and maybe he is. Maybe you're right. I don't know.
I think he is. I think there's something. Well, we'll leave that for later. I really want to let you all talk and try to keep my mouth shut as much as possible. How about you? We'll just go. Since we started with Richard, we'll go to Jordan next. How about you, Jordan?
Well, I have to admit that I don't know a lot about Jordan Peterson. I've never read anything that he's written. I've watched a few videos that family will send, and then watched some dialogues he's had. I watched a little bit of the Zizek thing with him and some of his other with Vervaeke, stuff like that. So I have recently paid more attention to it. It's something that I feel like you should pay attention to at least. But I don't have strongly formed opinions about him, and I wouldn't claim to have very grounded opinions about him generally, or his work or his career or anything like that. So I think my general impression, then my uninformed general impression, is that this is a kind of lightning rod figure who has forced conversations that a lot of different people want to have, at least the themes and the topics, but they have, for various and sometimes very different reasons, felt like they couldn't have out loud. But sort of as the dam breaks and it's all into the public, he's sort of become a lightning rod figure, whether because you absolutely love him or you absolutely hate him. And so that's about as sophisticated as I can get in terms of a general take.
Thanks, Jordan. Appreciate it. How about you, Larry?
Well, in a couple of words, I like him. I'm like Jordan. I don't know a ton about Jordan Peterson, but what I've seen of him, I tend to like, and it's more of a general impression that he is raw and unfiltered, a very authentic expositor of certain thoughts, and I tend to be raw and unfiltered. And so I kind of like public intellectuals, public pundits who are willing to sometimes shoot from the hip. And that's also, though, a criticism of him, because oftentimes I think he speaks on issues of which he knows little. He has fallen, I think, sometimes into the trap of thinking that he needs to have an opinion on everything. And sometimes that gets him, I think, into trouble, which I think he has gotten into a bit of trouble here with his spat with the Pope, because I think he is speaking on issues that I don't think he really is that conversant with.
Yeah, Larry, that's interesting. I just want to interrupt briefly, because this is why I was upset by the second tweet more, because the second tweet was in response to a very reasonable piece from the Washington Examiner from a Catholic perspective that simply just assumed that Jordan didn't know what he was reacting to. And Jordan, rather than listen to what he was told from a conservative Catholic source, just doubled down.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
I thought, which is when I decided I wanted to react to it. How about you, Laura?
So I really came to value Jordan Peterson when I was watching his old classroom lectures in 2017. And I value him as a person who has so much experience counseling people and studying psychology, and seems to have a deep understanding of what people are and what drives us and what our dilemmas are and how we can work through them and all those kinds of questions. And that was initially why I found him really interesting and really valuable. And he helped lead me back to the faith, which I'm very grateful for. And his career since then as a public figure, I don't know. It's
Yeah.
I'm not as enthusiastic about that as I was about the work he was doing at the University of Toronto. But I think he still has some value as a public figure. He's not the one person who has all the answers, but I think it's good to have him out there, and I still appreciate hearing his commentary on things. Though I was a little dismayed by this last one that we're going to talk about.
Thanks. All right. So I think that just leads us into going ahead and again, I'm going to kind of watch the comments and see what kind of questions we have coming from the audience as we go here too. But I'm just going to start it off like, so what do you all feel like that Jordan got wrong about social justice from a Catholic perspective? And what did he maybe get right? Like, where was he making a criticism that needed to be made? Anybody who wants to start?
Well, I think I'll start. I think that in some ways, perhaps, since he has been stung and stung again in many unfair ways by, in a sense, the left, especially those on the left, especially, I think in some ways he's reacting to the fact that the language of social justice in the Catholic Church has kind of, in many ways, become code for fighting for left-wing causes. And I think that he's reacting to that just a bit. And I think he's reading into the Pope's remarks just a bit too much. On the other hand, he's wrong, because I think that the moral component of the Catholic faith and her moral theology, everything ultimately has an orientation towards the realm of justice. All morality is ultimately oriented towards the realm of justice. Charity in the realm of justice, justice in the realm of charity. And therefore, what we call social justice, or the critique of inbuilt structural sins in our society, is an extremely legitimate exercise. And a lot of modern popes have engaged in it. It's not just this current one.
Anyone else? Feel free to chime in.
Well, let's see. Maybe this is throwing a bomb, but let me try it. I think it's an extremely unfortunate term. In the Ethics, Aristotle says justice is the virtue which is concerned with the good of another, and it is therefore redundant to speak of social justice. Justice is social in its essence. And then secondly, it seems to turn to something, well, let's see how to put it. It seems to minimize the fact that it's a virtue, the language does, as though the only place in which justice were to be found were the political community, or perhaps society more broadly, and not in the soul. And I think that's the source of its being so that language and some of the things that are in church statements and documents being so attractive to and easily distorted by the current progressive left. And then I'll throw. Is that enough bombs, or should I throw one more?
No, I think that's all good. Keep going.
All right. Well, then I'd say this. I'm a convert, as a number of you are, from the Episcopal Church. I have a great grandfather who was a Congregationalist minister, and I was brought up sort of Protestant, with the usual youthful atheism or idiocy of being a smart 17-year-old. And I have a feel for Protestantism. And I think for America, the politically and socially catastrophic decay of mainstream Protestantism is deeply connected to substituting the so-called social gospel for the mystery and adoration of Christ, for the sense of sin, for the desire for healing, and for the duties that follow from wanting to be like Christ, that are immediately personal duties. Now, it's true that man is a social and political animal, and that has consequences in the political and social world. But when you put the second great commandment before the first and forget the first, your religious life dies on the vine. And I think that's maybe that, together with the sexual revolution, are maybe the two deepest pathologies in our life in America, anyway. And so I have a very how shall I put it, unsympathetic view to talk, and especially loose talk, about social justice.
So, okay, am I on?
Yeah.
So I think I probably, maybe I'm a product of my time, as we all
are.
I'm less concerned about the term social justice. I think every term that's good can be co-opted and used, including salvation, including liberation, including spirituality, including transcendence. So I think what's important about emphasizing social is it is itself a reaction to Enlightenment individualism. And so so now the problem is that we get locked into is that the temptation is to oscillate between one pole or the other and to prioritize one over the other, individual versus social. So the very distinction isn't necessarily wrong, but I also think it needs to be, how do you interpret the distinction is really the difference. So on the one hand, a few anecdotes, both from high school. Okay. So when I was a high schooler, I wasn't raised Catholic. I was raised Protestant in a very individualist context, in a very much the sort of ethos that I think Peterson was voicing, actually. Forget about all this laws and politics stuff. There's no place, no business of that at the church. This is about saving your individual souls. You go knock on doors. You go stand with a megaphone somewhere and tell people they're sinners. They need to go to repent. So we got a lot of the repent. We didn't get a lot of for the kingdom of God is at hand. It was just repent. So that's how I was raised. But my first sort of encounter with the idea that maybe something in Catholicism is good and interesting, because I didn't get a lot of that growing up, was a high school teacher I had. I think it was in a politics or social, what do they call it? Social studies. And he, I guess, was Catholic. I don't know if he was or not. I never really figured that out. But he made an offhand remark about how, the Catholic Church, whatever you think about it, its current stance. So this would have been 2000 something, like early 2000s, so 20 years ago. Its current stance, it seems to be going more and more against, say, something like the death penalty. But also it holds to sort of, right, its opposition to abortion. So what we might call the consistent life ethic or something like that. And he's like, whatever you make of the Catholic perspective on these various issues, you at least should respect. There's a kind of consistency here. And that was just it was like a tossed out remark. I barely listened in class anyway. I was 16, didn't read books or anything. And I was like, that is kind of fascinating. Like there's a sort of entity here that seems to transcend the typical binaries that I hear in, say, political discourse or around election season. So that was fascinating and intrigued me. Fast forward, after I taught college after PhD, after a few years teaching college, and then I taught a year of high school here in St. Louis, and more of an closer to the inner city St. Louis. Very, very, I think it's probably the most diverse in terms of backgrounds school in the archdiocese. And I was tasked with the great and enviable job of teaching social justice to juniors, and that's what the class was called, social justice. And so I had one class, morality, one semester. Then I had another class, social justice, in the next one. My morality class was basically, if I put it among friendly company here, it was basically theosis. I tried to, I mean, we touched on some of the issues and stuff, but what I really wanted to get at was the theology behind the idea of you're not just moral because God's a really hard taskmaster or he's sitting on a bench and he just wants to judge everyone. But you're moral because becoming virtuous means becoming perfect, which is to say fully created, which is to say from the perspective and parts of the tradition that I like, becoming deified, becoming like Christ. And so that was that semester. But the second semester, I really had to face the social issues as social because that was the class. That was the curriculum. It was what I was told to do. What was interesting was, and this is where I think Peterson gets wrong, to get to the right. What he gets wrong is a simple turning of the tables within the dialectic of individual and social. No, the gospel of Christianity is not social. It's about an individual, the salvation of individual soul. So we're still playing by the same rules. There's really not a lot of critical and interesting perspective on perhaps the integrity that goes across that seeming opposition or polarity, which first intrigued me anyway as a high schooler. And so, but here's the thing: I think we could all agree there are extremes, therefore, on both sides. On the one hand, I'm with somebody like Nikolai Berdyaev, who, in his critique of Marxism, said like, look, even if we could engineer society to fix every societal ill, we would still have not moved at all on the tragic, the pure tragedy of human existence itself, namely death, right? So you're never gonna expunge or sate the human spirit's desire for transcendence just by engineering or re-engineering society. I think that's true. That's one thing. But the Peterson sort of emphasis on like, we don't need social justice at all. Well, the problem is when I went to teach my social justice class to a very mixed group of students, we couldn't even talk about the sin, as it's called many times in the magisterial tradition, the sin of racism, without me getting calls from suburban Catholic parents wondering about what this critical race theory stuff is all about. And I'm like, you mean JP2 when he came to our city and gave a talk on pro-life, most of which was about what he said, the sin that still racks this society, namely racism? And he saw that as a part of the pro-life cause and the entire teaching, the Catholic social teaching, to address racism for 2/3 of it. And he also talked about abortion for the last third. So I can't even talk about that in a Catholic school, in a class called social justice, in a tradition that uses the term, with several popes who have addressed racism as a part of the social concern of the magisterial tradition. Like that to me is another extreme. That's pretty absurd. So certainly I think what the interesting stuff and the difficult stuff is going to happen in the middle in a sort of synthesis, which doesn't simply let the dialectic of social versus individual dictate all the terms. And that's where I think Peterson's remark in the spat here just simply misses all of that. And so in some ways, I really kind of just look at this as unfortunate and honestly somewhat uninteresting.
There's a comment that was we have at least one priest in the chat here, Father Eric. So and I actually don't understand what he's talking about. So I'm going to ask you if anyone here knows what he's talking about. He says, I was allergic to social justice and social teaching until I learned about subsidiarity. Does anyone?
Oh, I know what he's talking about.
Okay.
The loss of the mediating institutions and the replacement by, in the United States, national welfare systems, Social Security, for example, which I think is socially unjust. It's terribly unfair to the young and so forth. And it's an entitlement, and it's going running out of gas. Bismarck is one of the people who instituted the large national social welfare systems. And it goes with a spirit of centralization and diminishes lower bodies, associations. You know, the history of the United States until the New Deal, and even in some ways until the Great Society, is largely the kind of thing Tocqueville talks about, namely Americans, often for religious motives, but not always, forming associations to, to correct, Tocqueville says, the error of individualism, to feel that they have the power to do good in the world, to help those in need. The YMCA, the YWCA has such a founding. It was an organization to help the young women who had come in from rural areas into large cities and were subject to all kinds of temptations and corruptions, to give them safe housing and so on. Yeah, see, Father Eric is saying it again, and I agree with it. And Europe is beset with centralized authority and bureaucracy, and has been ever since since Louis XIV, but especially since the French Revolution. And the spirit of charity in political action has tended in Europe to be governmental and central, and diminishes, I think it diminishes charity. There's a way to go. We used to have an American integralism. We used to actually cooperate with each other to bring religious principles into common action, social action, without going to Washington. I wonder if Father Eric this is what he has in mind. It's what I have in mind. A little more about that, just a little more anecdotally. I live in a town of about 30,000. It's where Union Oil of California started. It's called Union Oil because 4 or 5 independent oil companies, pillars of the local community, signed a consolidation. They have a museum. Those families are the people who started our library, our hospital. They in conjunction with their fellow citizens, they built our public parks. Rotary is an organization like that to this day. Rotary gives scholarships to the poor. In my community, that's mostly Latino kids. That's deeply embedded in the American ethos. And it's stronger here still than it is in Europe, because the principle of subsidiarity, which the founder of the social justice idea, Schiaparelli, stressed. Now, he was looking at the decay of, I think, feudal institutions and older forms of communal action, and saw them threatened and worried about the health of souls under those circumstances. The American answer to that is associations. There's that famous book, Bowling Alone, which talked about that problem. In this sense, I'm a reactionary. I think we used to know how to do these things, and all we have to do is remember and act.
Yeah. I'd like to interject here, and then maybe we could hear from Laura, who hasn't yet said anything. I just would quickly interject, as a Catholic worker and a follower of Dorothy Day, in order to dispel the unjust rumor that Dorothy Day was a socialist and a Marxist and all those sorts of things. Dorothy Day opposed Social Security when it was first introduced, on the grounds that it was just feeding the Leviathan of the state, which she opposed, and robbed us of the proper role of subsidiarity in the realm of charity. Now, full disclosure, I get Social Security now, but I paid into it, so I'm going to take it. But nevertheless, that was Dorothy Day's view as well, and for the same reasons that Richard delineates very. But anyway, I'll shut up now. Maybe Laura. I'd love to hear from Laura right now, but I'm not the moderator. Sorry, Nate. I'm assuming you're
No. I want you guys to talk. I'm just Go for it.
Okay, well, there are two things I can talk about in response to the question of what authentic social justice is and how it differs from how Catholic social justice differs from the secular concept of social justice. I could bring up Catherine Doherty, who was a friend of Dorothy Day. Yeah, Larry, you know about her? Yeah,
Yeah.
so one thing that is noteworthy about her in this context is that she had to flee Russia after the Communist Revolution. And when she went around America, um, telling people to be more active in social justice, one of the things she said to people was, if you don't do this work, the communists will do it. And while they're doing it, they'll evangelize the poor into communism and they'll be lost to the church, right? So that's a case where we can see that there's a clear split between Catholic social justice and other forms of social justice, and that there are many reasons for Catholics to be doing social justice, and one of them is that if we don't do it, someone else will.
So
Yeah.
what is that? So I'm going to just briefly interject here because I think this is a place where it's appropriate for me to interject as a non-Catholic. So I had the unpleasant experience not too long ago of wrangling over a bill from an allegedly Catholic hospital with my mother, who's on a fixed income, and has a cancer diagnosis, and they were entirely unreasonable and completely focused on collecting the entirety of the bill, and threatening collections. So what is the connection between, it seems to me that like the church seems to have whatever vision the church might have once had in our current system, it seems to have stepped back from it. Is that because, do you think that's because of, do we really think that the existence of the welfare state is causal there, or there's something else? Like, what is causing the church to step back from its role in terms of charity?
Well, it isn't entirely stepping back, but in some cases, hospitals are a good example. There's a lot that has happened. One thing is the emptying out of the religious orders so that Catholic hospitals aren't being staffed by people who have taken a vow of poverty and who are really just doing it all out of the goodness of their hearts. Catholic hospitals now basically have to be businesses the way other hospitals are, right? And then, of course, there's the fact that all hospitals in the United States are linked to various government programs and economic incentives and disincentives, so they're not operating independently. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I would toss Catholic universities into that mix as well.
Mm.
Having been involved, I mean, the entire Catholic school system, from elementary all the way up through university education, got started in this country at least in great part for the reasons of educating poor immigrants poor Catholic immigrants who came to this country. As you said, and if we don't do it, who will? And we've and then most of the universities and schools were staffed by, religious. And so it was relatively inexpensive. But now Catholic universities feed off of the trough of the Leviathan, off of the feds. And they've just professionalized themselves and thus secularized themselves as they've succumbed to the idolatry of accrediting agencies and all. But that's a whole different conversation for a different day. But nevertheless, it pertains once again to the role of subsidiarity and whether or not Catholic education has done its job as a mediating institution, as Richard says, to educate in the run of charity, and they don't do that anymore.
There's a kind of lack of spiritedness. I'm sufficiently politically incorrect, but I might say manliness in that regard. The my college, which I didn't found, although I'm close to the founding, has an unequal pay scale with a significant subsidy for children. And we do so because we understand that to be Catholic teaching about about a just wage with respect to family life. The founder,
Jordan, since you're looking for a job.
Yeah, well, I have 8 children, and our salaries are lower than the public universities or than all places practically. but they're enough to live on decently, more than decently, suitable to the dignity of the profession, you might say. And they just did that because they thought it was right, and then they went out to find the money to do it. There's all, it makes me think of Lewis's book, Men Without Chests. Ron MacArthur, who was the founding president of this college, he was a man with a chest, and the people he had associated with him were too, and they did it, and the place prospered. We have a second campus now. It was possible. The freedom we have in America made that possible. Ron used to say, if I were in France, I could never get this thing started. It's too bureaucratic. And we did have trouble with accrediting agencies.
The question I would ask you, Richard, is that are there enough men with chests left to roll back the clock to that kind of system? But and without, I mean, if we were, it seems to me that with the safety nets we have in place now, if those were gone, and I don't have any confidence that I don't personally have very little confidence that the church would intervene, because our culture is so overwhelmingly consumerist at this point.
That's a hard thing to judge. I don't know. I mean, there's an awful lot of voluntarism in this society still. And by the way, if we didn't have the social network, I don't know how much I put in, me and my employer, but probably $250,000 or $500,000 I would have had over the time in between. As a Christian, I'd like to think I would have given some of it and my time to do things. You take away, it makes me think of student body government in this way, right? If you take away the power, people don't step up with responsibility. Student body government is a cosplay, right? It's you have to be able to deploy the power you have in your organization, and that means in many cases money. And if you take, just as you take away the role of the father with too much resistance to unwed mothers and so on, and then he becomes unnecessary. Same thing happened to the French aristocracy, according to Tocqueville. They all were forced to move to Paris and wear fancy clothes and dance attendance on the king. And the result was they stopped caring about managing their estates and serving France. The world's imperfect. Power is not a bad thing. Power used wrongly is, but the less resources, the less respect, the subsidiary institutions from the family up to the local and state governments, the less they have of that, the less responsible they are. So do we have the character to recover? I don't know. I think so, but I'm kind of an incorrigible optimist.
Well, Sherry just asked the question that flashed up here.
Yeah.
Is Jordan Peterson a man with a chest, and is he making more men with chests? And I
Definitely.
think going back to Laura's comment, maybe Laura, then I'll swing it over to you so you could comment. I mean, you said that what drew you to Jordan Peterson was his deep, deep knowledge of human nature, because he's a psychologist and a counselor. And I think one of his great strengths is that he understands that there is no substitute for virtue.
Yeah, that's true. And he's personally very brave, and I think he encourages other people to be brave.
Yeah, I think that's right. He can be wrong on things, but that he'll stand against the wind is impressive, and it's a good model.
Yeah, I just saw an interview he gave with Joe Rogan on the topic of transgenderism, which of course is the topic that thrust him into fame in the first place because of his refusal to bow to the dictatorship of pronouns. And it was a very brave critique of transgenderism as a voracious ideology that is highly destructive. And so, yeah, I agree. He's a man of great courage, I think.
I got a complicating interjection maybe to make.
Go for it, Jordan.
Well, when you have a basically polarized system where the conservatives have their bastions, the progressives have their bastions, they lob bombs at each other, they each have their political party and politicians, all of them have their institutions and their code words. Is it really brave to just be a champion for one of them? Like you get rewarded.
Yes,
For,
I think
for being it just seems like we could hold up a whole host of other, left figures and be like, wow, they're really brave for, championing a cause that in most human societies for most history haven't been even close to the mainstream view and have actually been sort of castigated. It's like, to me, like being brave without context is really not Aristotelian. I mean, what are we being brave about? What's the context? What is the posture?
Let me tell you a story. See what you think of this. My world is, my world's the church, the family, America, but my daily life is in academia. I've taught for more than 45 years. I've been teaching since I was 19. Around in the early 90s, the accrediting agencies got a bee in their bonnet about diversity. And I was our representative to the accrediting agency. And I wasn't even commissioned to do this. I just went to the meeting and listened and stood up and spoke. And here's how it went. There was a panel on diversity. The moderator said, this is a very controversial issue. And then the panel spoke. And the first one said, I'm for diversity XYZ. And the next one said, I'm for diversity PQR, and so on. There were 4 of them. When they finished, I was sitting in the back of the room being a bad boy, the way I was in high school. I got up and I said, if this question is so controversial, how come everyone on the panel is essentially holding to one side? You could hear a pin drop. But I should confess, my blood pressure rose. I felt anxious. I was tense. I knew I was standing against a whole auditorium of 120 people just in raising that question. And then I went out and had a smoke. And then the executive director came out afterwards and said, "Oh, Richard, I want you to know we've made a good." He was really upset. And 20 years later, when we had a kind of rebellion that succeeded on that in the Western Association of Schools and Colleges, a very nice man from a Christian evangelical college came up to me and he said, "That was the decisive moment when I realized that this could be opposed." Now, that's a story about me, and it's okay, I think, if you think you've done something good to tell it. and I want to say that required a certain moral courage. Yeah. That's why I was afraid.
Yeah, so in response to Jordan, I would say that Peterson's situation is different now because he does have kind of a conservative posse around him, and he's got his Daily Wire deal and everything.
Yeah.
But when he first started speaking out about things, when he first went viral, academia was his milieu, and he didn't have any assurance that there would be anything waiting for him outside of academia if he alienated his colleagues or, lost his job or something. So definitely I would say he was being brave back then.
Especially the fact that he was an academic in Canada. Which is, light years up the scale of wokeness from the United States and the hegemony that with which it is applied. And I agree with Laura 100%, and also with Richard. I mean, when I was at DeSales University, and I'm not saying I'm a courageous person, but once I got tenure, I waited till then, I became a real pain in the rear end to the administration and its desire to basically follow whatever the accrediting agencies were saying, first on diversity, then on their latest mania, assessment. And then the coming together of assessment and diversity, and all of the dictatorial diktats from on high that went with that. I opposed. And the result of that was that I never got a decent pay raise in 20 years. And in very many other ways was marginalized at the university. Now, once again, I was happy there, and like Richard, I made a more than decent salary anyway, and so on. But I couldn't have lived with myself otherwise. And I think I was able to weather the storm because where I was. But Jordan Peterson, it did take courage. I think great courage for him to come out and say the things that he said in a Canadian academic milieu. At first, and also this, I would say this to Jordan, even now, even today, even though he has, as Laura says, I like that conservative posse around him, and that's exactly a great term for it. The fact is, there is still an overwhelming dominance in the academic realm of this leftist ideology, and now in our in the corporate world, in the government world. I mean, just in the media world, even a news venue like Fox News, for example, very conservative Fox News, they obviously now have style guidelines and reporting on transgendered issues, and all these bills before these various state legislatures that are trying to nuance this sort of transgender issue in grade schools and things like that. Even Fox News characterizes this bills opposed to gender affirming healthcare. Bills opposed to these are anti-transgender bills opposed to gender affirming healthcare. Just the language of that shows the hegemony of this idea in our culture right now. And so, yeah, Jordan Peterson has profited of late from his conservative views. He has a niche. He has something coming in. Probably it's a little bit lucrative for him, but he's still swimming upstream, and is taking a lot of public hits for it, and that has to, I think, count for something. But anyway, that's my 2 cents.
I guess what I just questioned is the sort of generic gesturing towards what we need is men with chests, and we need more brave people, because it's such a contextless thing to say. I mean, where I am right now, where I live, if you're going out talking about Jordan Peterson or you're opposing trans, like that wouldn't be brave at all. That's so normal. I mean, even up to the local government level, even like the major politicians, the superintendents. I mean, and yeah, I mean, where I went to Bible college, not at all. It would be run of the mill status quo stuff. So it's like, every side has their warriors. Everybody has a champion. So how could getting more warriors be an answer whenever every side has it? Doesn't determine anything.
Well, it's not the whole answer. It's I don't like talking about Donald Trump, but I will for a second. I was talking to a friend. In fact, it was the friend you were going to invite, Nate, and I subbed for it, David Quackenbush.
Oh, David, yeah.
Just yesterday, and we were wondering about the upcoming primaries in the Republican Party, and what he said was, whatever else Trump is, he's sort of all chest, his fans say he fights, right? And that's why he might still be attractive to a large number of voters who feel that they're being pushed around. And what I responded with was but responsible self-government depends on the logos. It depends on truth and decent rhetoric and understanding the other guy's position. And Trump is just awful on that. It's as though he has half a brain, whatever half it is that popped out your chat.
I think you're being generous, Richard.
Well, he's cunning. Anyway, so sure. I mean, all heart, no head is not the way to do God's work in this world.
So Paul Vanderkley, who was in the chat earlier, he's been kind of diving into the American Western hero archetype a bit. And like part of that Western hero archetype is that you have this bad good man or good bad man who does the violence on behalf of the Christian people who can't do it themselves. So I think that that archetype actually explains a lot about Trump and the Christian attraction to Trump. It's like he's kind of like he for in their imagination, he has that function of the good bad man who will do the things that need to be done that they can't do.
He's slain.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing is, I often said to my wife, I'm not a huge Trump supporter at all. In fact, I loathe and despise Donald Trump as a crazy man. But one of the things I noticed was that the crazier he got, the more insane his utterances, the more his popularity increased amongst us. And I think it's because not that so many of the Christians agreed with him or didn't think that he wasn't halfway insane, but it was almost as if they were saying, what we need truly is an insane person in the White House. We need a loose cannon. We need somebody who's just off the rails to drain that swamp and all
he
that.
He senses this too, because in one of his recent, and this actually coincided with this happened at the same time as the Peterson tweet, by the way. At the same time that Peterson was making these tweets at the Pope about social justice, Trump was on stage promising his supporters vengeance.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he was. Yeah.
So this is part of why I was concerned about the tenor of Peterson's tweet, particularly the second one where he said authentic social justice is not Christian, because then it's like, and he has, it's not something he doesn't have awareness of, because Peterson will talk about what happens when the right goes wrong. So he has this awareness of in what direction the right will go wrong when the right goes wrong, and that we have less of a sense of what happens when the left goes wrong. But to me, you're channeling the very things that are the temptations of the right when the right goes wrong, when you're using that kind of language.
Well, that goes to, I think, Jordan's critique, which I think is a critique that has legs, even though I don't completely agree with it. And so I would ask Jordan, I mean, in some sense, do you think that Peterson is perhaps virtue signaling to a certain right-wing base? Is he throwing red meat out, as Nate is implying here, to a right wing?
Well, I mean, I as I said before, it would be a little bit hypocritical of me to be like, well, I haven't read all of his books or anything, and then all of a sudden but look, it's I think easy to sort of, and maybe you guys were getting at this earlier with, like, especially as he's gaining in popularity and there's these certain pressures that are applied. I don't know. I go back and forth on this. Like, I watched Paul Vanderklay's most of that, his video on, he was talking to, I think, what's that name? Kale Zeldin. Yeah, they were talking, and there was a moment where they discussed, like, you got to think about Jordan's life right now. It's, he's going to these events. He's giving a lot of himself. He's fielding questions. He's discussing afterwards. Sometimes it's hours and hours. But, at the end of the day, he sits down, he opens Twitter, and he just kind of lets loose, right? He, like, unleashes. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, okay, but, at least the way where I was raised, you didn't get those kinds of excuses. And I know there's a new world and we got social media, right? Okay, well, take yourself off if you can't handle it. I mean, it's a thing where it's like, why is it like we demand virtue, but what is virtue without being able to undergo extreme burdens and difficulties, really? Right? Like, what happened to the civic sort of, like, even under great duress, I can stay composed. I can control my tongue. I can know when to speak and when not to. I can know the limits of my knowledge and when I can just admit ignorance, right? And so it's like I was raised with this narrative about the character of the leader, right? The virtue of the leader, the great, look at George Washington. How did he, this was a great time of turbulence and difficulty. How virtuous he was to do what he did in the conditions he did it. But then we get to someone like Jordan Peterson, and it's like, well, he had a long day. so you got to cut him some slack. Like, well, okay, so I'm saying this because, Larry, to your point, like, to your question, like, that does suggest a little bit to me that it's like there's a whole pretty extensive base that is willing to give him any out that they can find, and so he's giving them something they want to hear. They're giving him something back, and including things that used to be a part of that would have made you lesser than somebody that's a public, virtuous, admirable, imitable, thinker. Like, oh, well, when you have a long day, you're allowed to make major mistakes in public in front of millions of people. Really? Why? Well, when did that change? So I think in the end, we need to be careful. Not that anybody here is, but, like, when Christians, and I grew up in an evangelical background. I've got, lots of I saw some pretty intimate relationships I have. The kind of cognitive dissonance and somewhat horror at the popularity of, say, Trump among a certain demographic, mainly the ones I grew up with, and a certain generation, like the one above me, one or two above me, because all along they've been teaching me about the great, virtuous, bootstraps, pulling yourself up. Doesn't matter what you do, you don't make mistakes. You stay honest. You have integrity. Character matters. And all of a sudden, it's all traded in. This is a Pyrrhic victory. Yeah. And I don't want to equate Peterson with Trump, because Peterson obviously has, a whole background. He's got the clinician stuff. He's got like he is a professional, right? Like there's an actual history there, and he's got, he's a Jungian, so we'll take that. But so I don't want to equate them, but I do get nervous when it's like, well, it's okay, guys. Like it's okay that he said this thing because
well,
we'll
yeah, and I think it was Father Seitz in the chat said, maybe Twitter is not the best place for a Jordan Peterson. I mean, for example, I said I admire him because he's raw and unfiltered, like I am. Mm-hmm. The fact of the matter is, this is precisely why my wife forbids me to be on Twitter. Absolutely forbids me, because she says you are going to make a mistake that you are going to regret, and somebody's going to take a screenshot of it, no matter how fast you delete it, and that's going to be that.
True.
And so, in other words, maybe Jordan should have a little more self-knowledge here and stay off of Twitter.
Oh yeah, I'd be delighted.
He's aware of it though. He's had conversations about this. Like he's kind of aware that he has a Twitter problem. I'm sorry, Laura, I didn't know.
Oh, I was just saying I'd be delighted to see Jordan Peterson quit Twitter.
Yeah,
that would make my day.
I would be delighted to see everybody quit Twitter.
Yeah, that would be even better.
I just want to. There was a slightly. This is actually a friend of mine who's making a slightly critical comment toward me. I just want to make sure that everyone knows that I'm not hiding them. Last I checked, Nate couldn't tell the difference between hashtag social justice and social justice. Actually, I've made the point. The reason I reacted to the second tweet is because I do care about that distinction. And the second tweet, where he says there is no authentic social justice, there's no hashtag involved.
A lot of people in this little corner, when discussing this issue, have said the Pope should not have written hashtag social justice. A few people said he shouldn't have used the term social justice at all. And a few people said the term social justice is okay, but hashtag social justice is not okay. So that might be a thing to talk about.
Yeah, and then the other thing is like we have to realize that there's no way that the Pope is doing his own tweets.
Oh, totally, yeah.
It's just someone running the social media account.
Yeah.
There are probably things that the Pope has actually said in the past that are just being put out by the social media account, but it's not like he's on Twitter. So,
but then again, the buck stops there, and maybe the Pope should tell people, get the Vatican the heck off Twitter.
Yeah, that's a good. Yeah. Now, that is a discussion I would like to hear. Should, in fact, the Vatican set an example by just getting off of Twitter and not participating in whatever? Because I think this is the one thing we would probably have almost universal consensus on, is that Twitter is not good.
Well, my impression of the Vatican's Twitter account is that it's a place to post boring platitudes, and
exactly.
It's an account you can follow if you're on Twitter and you're like, well, I don't really want to be reading hot takes on everything all the time. I should read something that's kind of nice and encourages me to do the right thing in a vague and bland kind of way. So I'll follow the Vatican's Twitter account. That's pretty much it.
I have a question, if it's okay, I throw out there.
Go for it, Jordan.
One thing that is really difficult for me as, young father, I've got 4 kids, I'm trying to raise them.
About 4 kids? About 4 kids. I mean, is there some doubt as to how many you have?
Well, actually, yeah, my daughters would speak up and be like, "No, you have 5," because we did have a miscarriage, and they call it which, but it still wouldn't be right to say about, right? But so no, here's my anecdote. Okay, we went from 0 to 3 kids, not just about, Larry. It was 3. In Rhode Island, where I commuted to Boston College and I was in the historical theology program. Okay, so don't judge me, but I'm doing my best to go through a program that's a very good program, and I learned a lot, and I appreciate it, and I would do it over again. So everything else I'm going to say, have that in mind. But you're not making a ton of money. It's not necessarily the lucrative thing. You definitely can't expect a job. I don't really see a lot of programs scaling back their acceptance of graduate students and the low pay that they get, even though they're teaching classes that all students are paying the same amount for. Right. And I go from 0 to 3 kids, which I think is a good Catholic thing to do, from what I heard. And so now here's the thing. We can't afford. My wife is a nurse. She can only work part-time. We don't pay for childcare. It's always one of us taking care of them all the time. I can't afford. I'm trying to do a PhD program for a job, in a career that probably won't have any outcome. But I'm doing it because I love it. So of course that's my choice. So that's on me. But the reason why we could have 0 to 3 kids is because of state insurance. They paid for it. And it wasn't my Catholic employer. It wasn't my wife's Catholic employer. It was the state. I think that's good that we had 3 kids. I think it's good we didn't go into debt having a family. I think it's good that we spend time with our kids and we raise them ourselves. So this is the real world that we're in now. Catholic institutions in big ways have backed off. And there's a lot of factors to that, of course. There's a corporatization of the university, right? There's the commodification of everything. There's the watering down. We could go through the whole list, right? But it doesn't matter. When I'm a father and I'm having 3 kids and the state is paying for it, I'm thanking God. Was it bureaucratic? Sure. Did I have to be on the phone 2 hours? Sure. That's annoying. But I didn't pay a dime until I moved here to a state where they don't have anything like that. And I'm working for a Catholic employer. I have my 4th kid, and we paid quite a lot of money out of our pocket that we didn't have. So my point is, when I'm thinking about social justice in the Catholic world right now, it sounds nice to say, I wish we could go back to a time when the Catholic Church wasn't racked by scandal, paying out lots of money to do settlements and destroy records. I wish that too. I wish we lived back at a time whenever the Catholic Church and the state maybe could have something more like a useful, efficient relationship. Maybe that could be good. That's not this time. So what does Catholic social justice really look like here and now? And why would it be the case, for example, that opposing Rhode Island's state insurance is in the interest of Catholic social justice whenever it actually allowed me to have a Catholic family?
I think, and I don't want to co-opt anybody else here, but I think this is a very, very important point. And when Richard was speaking initially, about, the mediating institutions and subsidiarity, and this will be somewhat of a critique of what Richard was saying, so he can come back at me. I was sitting here thinking, yeah, that's true to a point. But the fact is, one of the reasons why Social Security was enacted was because millions and millions of senior citizens in the United States were living in poverty. One of the reasons why there was federal civil rights legislation is because the local level dropped the ball on civil rights. The reason why we got child labor laws was because the corporate world and various other entities in the United States were employing little kids working 12 and 13 hours a day. Labor unions at one time were suspect as communist in this country. And so I'm not certain that before the rise of the welfare state in the United States that these mediating institutions were doing their job. And that is one of the reasons why we saw the rise of the welfare state. So I don't know. I just throw that out there. I'm in other words, I'm tending to agree here with Jordan.
That's related to the question I tried to ask earlier too. And only you're bringing it like the historical lens of like, hey, even then it wasn't necessarily as perfect as we want to romanticize it to have been.
Well, I don't think it was perfect, but one point Larry raised earlier is relevant to this, and that is consumerism and excessive expectations. There's a lot of complaint about how we're supposedly poorer than we were a generation ago or two. I've done a lot of research on that, and basically it's bunk. The consumption is enormously higher now in all quintiles of of our society, economically speaking. Have you ever looked at the size of houses historically, square footage?
Yeah. Hey, I grew up with four siblings in a tiny little cracker box of a house.
Yeah, we had somewhat better. We had, what was it, 1,600 square feet, I think. 4 kids in that house, and there was a divorce. So there were I had 2 stepsisters that would come. I had 8 kids. My youngest used to sleep on the dryer. It was warm, and he kind of liked it. I don't know. In a way, it's kind of related to spiritedness. I had no family plan at all. I was in love, and she was in love with me, and we just had kids. And were crowded. Now, there are other forms of support, not just associations. There's family. If you weaken the family, then it's not likely that your parents will do what my parents did for me when I got up to the 5th kid. They bought the house I now live in, and I rented it from them. I didn't have the capital to make the down payment, and years later I bought it. Love wants to spread, and one of the most important ways it wants to spread is in children. Mm-hmm. The element of, I kind of resist the notion of Catholic social teaching. I've looked at the compendium, and it's got everything from little tiny allocutions to Lord knows what. It ought to be called something like a whole lot of things priests, bishops, and the popes have said over the years on various questions that arise in society.
Yeah,
I think there ought to be a 3-page version of it that is more general and coherent, that leaves things to be figured out by the laity in their actual circumstances. Like Jordan speaking of, what are the actual circumstances in Rhode Island? What were the choices you were facing, and so on.
Yeah.
And then in light of those, how do we sustain your chance for a large family?
So I want to draw attention to this comment because it's a very Catholic thing that comes from my very agnostic brother-in-law.
Yeah.
And he says family is the cornerstone of the foundation of society. When we are unable to afford to have families due to the economic, society will collapse, all according to plan. And I think he's pointing out here, and he makes a later comment about like WEF policies pushing in a direction of population control. And I think maybe, and when you were talking about how love wants to grow, Richard, I think you were pointing at where the critical difference is between, I would say, hashtag social justice that you see coming from the left, which is very focused on population control, acting as if it's evil, as if it's evil to have children, versus the Catholic position, which is complete. This is where it is the most opposite. So I'm wondering can we look at that point where it's diametrically opposed to kind of get at the core of the difference?
Are we talking about language and terminology?
Or just whatever, or the spirit of it, mm-hmm. Why is that difference so pronounced?
Language does count.
I think it's important too. Oh, I'm sorry, Richard. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just going to say one of the terrible signs of our times is the abuse of language, the carelessness of the Pope, the bluster of Trump, the pathetic lies Biden tells, the acceptance of speech as manipulation and advertising. It goes hand in hand with consumerism.
It does.
Love of the Logos means adoring the only begotten Son of God. And it also means caring about accuracy and truth in what you say. Now, that's what am I saying? I'm giving a sermon. This is a moral challenge that faces us. And is it a question of justice? if justice commands all the virtues, which is what Aristotle says in Ethics, among the virtues is truthfulness. And particularly, by the way, truthfulness about yourself. In fact, in Aristotle, that's almost all he talks about. The opposite is, the two extremes are irony and boastfulness. Not lying about some fact, but misrepresenting yourself. But that's a part of a general duty to respect speech.
Yeah, that's what I think. One of the better things that Jordan says is to tell the truth, or at least don't lie.
Yeah.
Well, in that vein of truth telling, I mean, as a Catholic worker, I'm often critical of the Leviathan of the states, centralization, the denial of subsidiarity, and all these. But Jordan raises a very good question. Jordan Wood,
Which one?
and not Jordan, but Jordan. I mean, if you go back to your brother, I love his screen name, by the way. Your brother, Slacarius. That's great. I mean, go back to Malthus and the original Malthusian analysis of population. What was his ultimate aim? His aim was to undermine the growing trend in Great Britain towards a welfare state. And his argument was that if you start giving money to the poor, they're going to populate, and they're going to populate like crazy. And the last thing in the world we want are more poor people. And so the whole thing was this trumped up, pardon the pun, this trumped up sort of population bomb apocalypse that was going to come upon us, especially with the poor, which was one. And so I would say that we have to be aware of the truth of those who opposed the rise of welfare states as well, that their motives weren't all about, well, we have to preserve mediating institutions and all this kind of thing. A lot of it was a sort of almost Darwinian, and Darwin leaned on Malthus, a kind of Darwinian dog eat dog sort of world. And then, to once again go back to what Jordan was saying, I'll point to my own situation. Last year, my wife lost her job because she refused the COVID jab. And in losing her job, we lost our health insurance. I am currently without health insurance. Her brother lives with us. He's mildly autistic. He has no health insurance because we can't afford it. And so I'm 64, and in 6 months, I can go on this great Leviathan program called Medicare. And I'm looking forward to it because as it stands now, nobody in the church or anywhere else is stepping up to the plate to say, well, there's all these people without health insurance. What can we do about this? And so the state intervenes and says, okay, here's Medicare. And so to talk about the actual lived experience of people, if we're going to be critical of the welfare state, and I often am, we have to be aware of why the welfare state arose in the first place.
We also might want to pay attention to, I heard this interview with the author, now I'm forgetting his name, the author of a new book. He's out of Princeton. It's a book called Poverty by America. He makes the point that it's a pretty normal trope to assume that welfare state is basically just going to inoculize people and make them lax and not motivated to do anything, be innovative, compete, work. But that actually, according to him, so you got to look at the numbers and all that, and you could but according to him, there's something like $134 billion per year left on the table by the lowest 10% of the people in the country, mostly because they don't even know how to get the money. So all this money is being dumped at the program. It's not really being dispersed to those for whom the program. No. So what do you do there? You make a critique of the government. Wow, it's so inefficient, stupid. They can't even give the money that's allocated to these people. But also, simultaneously, if it's true, it simultaneously undermines the idea that all the poor people are just sort of waiting around to collect this stuff, and it's going to ruin American values, etc. Most of them don't even take it.
Well, for my own part, I just want to say I don't think that about the poor.
Well, I'm not saying you did either, Richard. So let's be clear.
One of the premises of modern political and economic systems is that people have a tolerably good idea of their own interest in many ways. That lies behind the idea of government by the consent of the governed. That Lincoln said, and I think that men are not good enough that anyone should be ruled by another without his consent. And what he meant by that was you are aware of your good in a much more direct and motivating way than other people are. And the number of people who rise from poverty through that capacity in human nature is striking, and has been, by the way, for the world for maybe 300 years now. The material prosperity of the world is not perfect, and it's not perfectly distributed. But it's ridiculous to imagine that the material prosperity of modern times is comparable to the wretched material conditions of humanity from the time of the pharaohs to the time we respected the dignity and liberty of the individual in running his own affairs and cooperating with others to run them better. That's one of the great facts of history. Now, having said that, it's perfectly, I believe you, Jordan, that these people leave that money on the table. I believe you. Politics, government is never perfect. It's always, and it's always about, well, it's about justice, but it's also about what actually works. And if those programs don't actually work, that's something to be concerned about.
Are we a little too quick, though, sometimes to give liberalism the credit for the massive increase in living standard or cost? Because I'll give for example of like maybe we can't give liberalism. If you look at the standard of living in Tsarist Russia compared to under Stalin, and you're only looking at in materialist terms of where's the better standard of living, the truth of the matter is that Stalinist communism delivered a much better standard of living to the people of Russia than the Tsar ever did.
I've just been reading Kotkin's book, the second volume of his biography of Stalin. It's a trilogy. And I don't think that's true. The agricultural per capita production in 1914, I think it was higher than it was in the late 30s, and not just because of a particular bad year. Even the good years were not that impressive. Now, partly what happened there was Stalin spent it all. He caused people to starve by taking their crops for the sake of establishing heavy industry. And why did he do that? Well, partly because of a kind of dream of technological mastery, and partly to build the military, so that the steel and iron and electricity production and so on in the Soviet Union was enough to hold off the Nazis, as it turned out.
Yeah. The point of my remark wasn't to be an apologist for Stalin, which is the last thing that I would be. The point of that remark is like maybe looking at it from a quantitative analysis is not the best way.
Oh,
that's what I'm suggesting.
That I think is the part of what we call social Catholic social teaching that is particularly clear in John Paul and Benedict, I think, but it's not absent in Francis, and that is that economics is a human activity, and that companies and associations and governments are all human things, and they have to develop the person, and mere material abundance is it's not a bad thing, but right. it's probably not the most important thing.
Yeah, that's all. That is just the direction I was wanting to push it. Thank you, Richard. Yeah. So that begs the question. It's like, so, I mean, I promise not to talk much. So I'll just sort of frame this as a question and I'll let you guys talk about it. So it seems to me that one of the things that seems evident to me from looking at Catholic social teaching, and I'm not a Catholic and my knowledge is limited, but it seems to me that Catholic social teaching seems to be neither in favor of unrestrained liberalism with nothing to mitigate it, nor in favor of Marxism. Sure. That whatever system is favored by Catholic social teaching is something that is in between. and that has valid critiques of both extremes.
Part of that
Certainly.
is the teaching of the universal destination of goods, which is a Catholic principle, has roots in Aquinas and so forth, that ultimately nobody is the absolute owner of anything in some sort of completely unbridled way. The fact is that private ownership of things is allowed, and it's a good thing, and it redounds to human welfare and well-being to be able to own things, to have the incentive to build things and to own them. But that we recognize that also brings a responsibility within charity to live in a manner conducive to neighborliness, to taking care of the least among us, and that therefore everyone ultimately does have a claim. That's it's kind of the justification for why it's okay to assess taxes and to take some of that largesse from people.
Sure.
Because the goods are not ultimately completely ours. And I think this is why Catholic social teaching occupies a kind of middle zone between the sort of radical laissez-faire libertarian what's mine is mine idea and the collectivist idea where nothing is yours.
I think that idea was somewhat nakedly espoused in the 19th century, the so-called Manchester School and similar things. And it's I don't think it's ever been actually dominant, and certainly not in the United States. The court tended in that direction in the late 19th century, but not the people as a whole. By the way, the notion, I have one word for this that ought to be paid attention to, and that's stewardship.
Yeah.
The man who manages, a woman who manages great wealth, is immoral if he only uses it to either gratify his desires. Is it Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos? Somebody has a service yacht for his yacht. That's not moral. I mean, that's
Right.
Plato would say it, Aristotle would say it, Thomas would say it, Adam Smith would have said it.
Yeah.
Adam Smith wrote a book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. His thesis is kind of that we can rely more on sentiment than on the complete rule of reason in our moral activity, but the morals he's espousing are not untraditional morals through and through.
Right.
So yeah, you want. I mentioned my own house, which my parents bought, and then I bought back from them slowly. I share it, and I have a nice little small pond, and artificial stream, and a little playhouse. And I share it with the neighborhood kids almost absolutely freely. I mean, if someone's really ill behaved, I don't think we've banned anybody yet, but we would if we were disruptive. Well, what I got in that direction by saying to myself, asking myself, why did God give me this? It's so obviously suited to little children. I mean, I made it for my own children. Or they made it. They got older and helped me do it. But anyway, and my wife did probably more than I did. But anyway, so we have that. What's the point of it? The point of it is to be shared, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right. The idea of commonwealth. I mean, and of course, in Deuteronomy, God says the land is mine. So we should remind we are only stewards.
We are only stewards.
Yeah.
So yeah.
But I see too, Sherry posted about neighborliness went away. And so my former colleague at DeSales, Dr. Rodney Hauser, liked to say the fall of our civilization began with the development of the attached garage and the electric garage door opener, because now you no longer have to say anything to your neighbors when you come home. You just go right into your castle. And I've often said it ought to be a mandate of all zoning laws everywhere that every house has to be built with a front porch, because. Now.
Right, that lack of neighborliness is a really big deal. Sherry, I mean that's actually C.S. Lewis in The Great Divorce. Like that's kind of his image of hell, right? Is everyone living in these great big houses, having everything that they want, completely separated from one another, and that's hell.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Here's another little very short story. During COVID, um, traffic diminished at the beginning, and walking increased. So now my neighborhood is, I'm in Southern California, and things are expensive, but it's a nice mixed neighborhood. They're little tiny houses too. Mine is 2,700 square feet. It's not huge, but I have nice landscaping, which, by the way, was kindness. The judge who lived down the road had a tractor, and he gave it to me when I first got the property, so that I could move the dirt around and make it the way I wanted. Anyway, so the walkers would come by. Suddenly, in COVID, everybody was walking, So some of these kids I'm talking about who come to my little play garden, a little magic Japanese garden with a tiny tea house and everything, they got invited because everybody was out on the street again. You'd come out and say hi. They'd say, "Oh, your flowers look so nice." And then I'd say, "Oh, by the way, come see my pond and playhouse." And they look at it and say, and then it would strike me, particularly if I had kids with them, say, "Bring the kids by," neighborliness. Mm-hmm. Aristotle says friendship perfects justice. And there's a lot to that. Mm-hmm. Human contact. Oh my God, that's besides corruption of language, the lack of human face-to-face contact is a deeply serious wound in our times, I think. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize they need it, because I hear younger people all the time expressing their gratitude for systems that allow them to bypass human contact, right?
Yeah.
So like, oh, I want to go to that restaurant because I can order my food on a screen and it'll just appear somewhere and I won't have to talk to anyone, and they like that. Yeah.
And of course, technology drives a lot of this.
Sure does.
Yeah, I mean, with the invention probably of the smartphone, I mean, we've all seen that phenomena. You can't ride a subway anymore and actually have a conversation, but everybody's staring down at at their phones. You can't be at a sporting event and talk to the dude next to you in the seat because he's looking down at his phone.
Yeah, and increasingly people think you're a major weirdo if you want to make small talk with them and you don't already know them.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the sporting event thing, that's really weird too, because I remember the most fun I've ever had in a sporting event in my life. When my senior year of high school, me and a group of friends for our senior skip day, we went to a Mariners game because Nolan Ryan was pitching and he was chasing the 5,000 strikeout milestone, and we were hoping to catch it. And he didn't in that game, but we sat next to these guys from Boston who were going all around the country following Ryan because they wanted to be there for that moment. And it was the most fun I've ever had at a game. And it was fun because of the people that we were watching it with, because they were so friendly and so boisterous, and they would heckle all the ex-Red Sox players that were on either team. And it was a blast. And now you go to a game and it's like, it's like you said, people are on their phones.
You can't even have chanting in the crowd without it's being coached by the internet, by the
Yeah.
My favorite moment in my baseball fan career was the one World Series game I got to see. Dodgers and Yankees in the Dodger Stadium. And I hated Reggie Jackson.
He was my favorite player.
He lost the ball in the sun, and it hit him in the chest. Mm-hmm. That was part of a major Dodger comeback, and we won the game.
Yeah.
And I told you before that story, but I'm spirited. I'll make a fuss in a crowd. So I jumped to my feet and started chanting, "Reggie," and I started it personally.
Sarcastic chant.
And it wasn't some manipulator on the public address system. It was me.
So we're bringing together enemies in this conversation. Dodgers fans and Yankees fans talking together. It's a miracle.
I love to hate the Yankees. I want the Yankees to win the American League every year so that we can play them in the World Series.
My wife and her sister are both from LA and root for the Dodgers, so it's all right. I've come to terms with it.
That's how old I am. In fact, we're for them because of Jackie Robinson.
Yeah.
My dad was a big supporter of early civil rights movement, and
Yeah.
that's how we became Dodger fans.
Well, that's talking about the early civil rights movement. So, I mean, I think that connects to the theme of Catholic social justice too. I mean, what you since you lived through it, what was the role of the Catholic Church in that era?
Well, I wasn't Catholic.
Oh, you weren't Catholic. Okay.
But I was in church, and in a public high school. In the public high school, we had a civil rights club in my high school.
Well, I was Catholic, young, in the 60s. I was born in 58. And I do recall that the church was pretty big in the civil rights movement. I know that, for example, I can't remember who it was. There was a bishop in Louisiana that ordered the desegregation of the Catholic schools. And he then excommunicated politicians, Catholic politicians,
yes. All right.
who opposed the desegregation of the schools. And then, of course, you had other, famous Catholic priests and so forth that were, marching with Martin Luther King and so on. So I think the church was actually, to her credit, I think she was pretty active in the civil rights movement.
That's my reading of it too. That's an area I've studied. That's a central theme in not the church in it, but the movement itself in the book I've written on America.
Yeah, and to the point of Jordan Peterson, the fact is that the Catholics that were involved in the civil rights movement did so precisely out of not just out of a strong human devotion to human rights and the well-being of their neighbors, but also out of a devotion to Catholic social teaching. That racism is a structural sin in our society, not just a personal vice, but when it gets then instantiated in institutions, it's a social sin.
Certainly in the law when it happens, but also in things like the disregard for neighborhood integrity and redevelopment, for example. I'm not big on the notion of structural sin, but there are cases, and that was one of them. My own neighborhood in Sacramento was right next to a more heavily black neighborhood. Nice middle class neighborhoods. The black one was poor. The public library was over there, and I used to go. I used to go to that library all the time. I'd walk to it. When the interstate was being built later on, I'm a kid in elementary school when I'm in the 50s, right? By the way, I felt safe in that neighborhood too. The Ben Franklin store there was where I went to look at airplane models when I wanted to tell my parents what to give me for my birthday or something. Well, they put I-5 right through there, and it's separated the neighborhoods. There are things worse than that, where the property was condemned in other places, and the effects of that were long lasting. Now if it's not racism in the sense that they were saying blacks are inferior, it's at least racism in the sense that they were insensitive to the dignity of the people in those neighborhoods. They needn't have been segregationists, probably weren't, at least in California. But that happens. And one should look for ways to remedy the effects. Certainly one should not do it again. That's structural. I see that.
So Sherry asked the question regarding the civil rights movement. Would have been considered progressive social justice back in the day? No.
No. It would have been considered sort of foundational declarationist, equal dignity of human beings politics. It would have had nothing to do with progressivism. The Roosevelt administration was as bad as anybody else on those matters when it came to urban projects and similar things. I agree.
Well,
And
it
the
I think it depends on the. I think it would depend on the part of the country you're from. The
Yeah,
region of the country. Certainly, like my grandmother's family, which and one of her brothers was actually appointed to the federal court by John F. Kennedy because of his pro-civil rights stance. Like her family was definitely considered progressive in Alabama because of their pro-civil rights stance. So I think,
they probably would have called it liberal in the day, wouldn't they?
But
yeah,
yeah,
progressive would have been less the term. It would have been liberal. Yeah.
Yeah,
but
I
but
think I think what Sherry's getting at is just the fact that if you follow Catholic social teaching, you will seem progressive or liberal or whatever to some people some of the time, and then you'll seem conservative some other times, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
exactly.
You know,
And
Woodrow Wilson was a total villain on segregation and civil rights, and he's a primary figure of.
well, and one of the reasons why John F. Kennedy went to Texas and eventually was assassinated was because he had such opposition from within the Democratic Party
Yeah,
to his civil rights movements. We tend to forget that during that time, you were more apt to see people in favor of civil rights from the Republicans than you were from the Democrats. There were the
Right.
so-called boll weevil Democrats of the South, in particular, the Dixiecrats, all
that's
right,
right.
who were resolutely opposed to civil rights,
Absolutely.
and it was more the Rockefeller Republican types that were in favor of civil rights. So this line of demarcation, yes, in some circles it would have been considered liberal and progressive if you were civil rights advocates, but in other circles not. It would have been considered just, well, this is the right thing to do. I mean, this is the
Right.
moral thing to do.
That's the way it was in my high school. That was the consensus feeling.
Yeah,
Students, teachers, administration, the whole bit.
I think
It wasn't forced on us, but it was in the air.
yeah, exactly. And as someone who lived through the 60s, the fact of the matter is that there was such a groundswell of support across the ideological spectrum for civil rights. It just was in the air, as you say, and it was just considered the right thing to do. And you found both conservatives and liberals fighting for civil rights.
Yeah, so Sherry asks, why didn't the church call for it earlier then? I think there are some things to say about that. Certainly, like I mentioned Catherine Doherty before, she did a lot of work on racial reconciliation and anti-racism, you could say. And that would have been in like the 30s and
Yeah.
40s, 50s, right? So earlier than that, she was, she started kind of a movement, and she was living in Harlem for a while, and there were priests who were working with her. So there was stuff going on there. And then I don't know about Dorothy Day and Peter Morin. Were they involved in work like that?
Oh yeah, they were very
Yeah.
much in favor of the civil rights and the rights of blacks and so on.
Yeah. So
But
there were Catholics doing that work, but I think it just happened that a time arrived when enough things converged that it was an opportune time to do something at a large scale, right?
and it has to be remembered. Yeah, absolutely. It has to remember the hierarchy was probably a little bit slow in some ways, but we have to remember the context of the times, which is Catholicism was still fighting for its place at the social and political table in many, many ways. Also,
Yeah, that is an important point, because Catholics themselves were very much still a cultural minority status at that time,
and often quite poor. So one of the things people don't like to talk about is the fact that very, very many ethnic Catholics, be they Irish or Polish or Italian, were racist as hell. And I mean, one of the staunchest places that opposed the desegregation of the schools was Boston. Back in the 70s, as you saw this uprising of Irish Catholics and Protestants, against. Now, part of it was that there was also a certain contrived social engineering involved in busing students across cities and so on. But there was a deep racist component to it as well. And so I think that was another reason why, in some sense, the church was a bit slow to have this massive official response. And it was more piecemeal and, just various Catholics like a Dorothy Day, a Catherine Doherty, a Daniel Berrigan, these sorts getting involved.
So Paul's back. We got to tell him what he missed.
You'll have to watch it back, Paul. Jordan, look like you're about ready to say something.
Another question to throw out there, and Laura, I'd really be interested in your opinion on this. So I think there's a way in which we've some noted at the beginning that Peterson's background as a kind of clinician and having like a counselor, having patience and stuff is a strength. But when we get into the Catholic waters here, and we're talking, and Nate, I think you made the point about sort of the two extremes are critiqued at the same time. That's true all the way from Leo XIII on, at the very least. But I wonder then if it's what works in the context of, is it a liability as well at the same time to say most of my thinking has been formed on what works when I'm giving advice or doing counseling with an individual person? How do you get your life together, clean up your room, right, etc.? Like these things work well when you're having this face-to-face direct. There's a certain dynamic, right? When you turn to the kind of realm of the messy realm of politics and society and culture wars, like, if you got a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Like, is there that dimension as well going on? Like when Peterson's looking out here and he's looking at what the Pope's saying, it's like, is all he's seeing like, oh wow, this social justice stuff? It must just be that he's sort of infantilizing everyone, and they're not going to grow up and take responsibility. Like I tell all of my patients, like I'm just asking, do you think there's a possibility or even a reality at this point where that also has become a liability when you get into these realms? I really don't have a strong opinion. I'm more, yeah. Laura, what do you think, Laura?
Well, that's an interesting point, and I think that's a valid point. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, and it relates to how I felt when I looked at Peterson's poll about what is Christianity really about at Pontifex? Is it take up your cross and accept suffering and be saved as an individual, or is it rebel against oppression? And which I thought was a false dichotomy.
Yeah, definitely was a bad framing altogether.
the founding story is the Exodus, isn't it? and then the Passion is the perfection of that story. Right? But freedom from slavery is like, it's our thing.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Yeah.
Including slavery from sin. I do think this, though. I said it much earlier that the first commandment is the first. The sense that I am in need of impossibly unmerited love and forgiveness, and that there is one who has offered it to me, died for me. I'm going to sound like a Protestant now. Huh? I was washed in his blood, and I should be like him. But first, I was a sinner. I was, everything I did was empty in some way. It still is in some respect. I'm in constant need of the transcendent, and I must adore him and love him, and therefore serve him, and therefore offer myself to others, and to him. If you don't put that at the center, things fall apart.
Right, because you'll lack the gratitude to properly do the second.
Yeah, doesn't Thomas say something like gratitude is sort of the root of all the virtues? I feel I've heard that text.
You would know better than I would, Richard.
Actually, I haven't taught a lot of Thomas, even though
okay.
I'm at Thomas Aquinas College. I have some. For me, I'm more poetic. My Thomas is Dante.
Oh, okay.
Or St. Augustine. The Confessions. It was we were talking about, how you came into the church. Well, it was Bach's Matthew Passion and St. Augustine's Confessions for me. And then a friend who said, in effect, well, if that's what you feel, somewhere there it says you should be part of a body. Oh, yeah, that's right. Somewhere in there it does say that. I guess I better get on that,
So I would like to add something, if you don't mind. I think I like obviously I agree, Richard, that the first commandment is the first, and you should love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. But I do take it that, and this is, I think, the dynamic that Peterson's missing, right? Mm-hmm. It's easy to just rank things and have a hierarchy and which one's more important in the abstract. But where I do think the Christian sort of radicality comes across, and I think the Catholic workers are an example of this insight, is I find myself when I give my entire heart to God. It's the very God who has also joined himself in solidarity with the least of these, and who says, whatever you did to them, you did to me. And then I read in 1 John, how can you love God who is invisible if you don't love your neighbor who is visible? That's impossible, right? And so all of a sudden, and then I read, of course, from my guy, I go to letter 2 from St. Maximus the Confessor on love, who ends up saying that, in fact, the very same love with which you love your neighbor is the love with which you love your God, because your God has become your neighbor. And so this kind of insane synthesis, Aristotle says justice is perfected in friendship. Jesus says, I have called you friends. That seems impossible, even from Aristotelian grounds. I can barely be a friend with a subordinate or someone who works for me, right? Well, how in the world could I become friends of God? Well, he tells you in the Gospel of John, it's if he becomes one of us, so we can call him brother, right? And so that's to me, that's the dynamic, the condescension, the self-abasement and the kenosis of the Son of God, who, yes, receives all might. He himself is the first and the second commandment. He's the object of both at once, in all, right? As Colossians 3:11 says. So this is the part where I'm like, look, we can't do this pole thing and get at the heart of Christianity. We can't do this false dichotomy thing. He's already transgressed the dichotomy in his own person. And whenever Saul is on the road and he gets blinded by the light, the Lord says not, why do you persecute these people that like me and follow my teachings? He says, why do you persecute me?
Right.
So his insane solidarity, which is also a Catholic social principle, right? Not just subsidiarity, but solidarity. That is kenosis. That is the God that when I give myself to him, I find myself plunging myself into those that he has plunged himself into, which is the least of these. That's the heart of the concern of social justice, even if we don't always agree about how that should be done and so forth.
And my guy, Hans
Also,
Urs
Jordan.
von Balthasar, my theologian that I did my dissertation on. I mean, he follows
Well, who's that?
You would know, Jordan. A metaphysical theological ontology that follows a motif that we call gift and reception. That essentially all of creation follows this gift reception model. It's essentially gift turtles all the way down. And when one finally embraces the totality of the significance of that, the utter gratuity of everything that we have received, then we realize I am not my own. To be a Christian, as Jordan just correctly points out, is to realize I am not my own. I am to be for others, because all is gift. And therefore that imposes upon me an entirely different ordo of moral thinking. That implies definitely some social elements, not some.
I want to stress the word social there, because there's a tendency in our times, for various reasons, to think social equals political.
Yeah, true.
Simply, and it's not divorced from it, but most of you're giving yourself to someone else. Well, say in my profession, most of in my work life, my giving myself to someone else means such things as attentive listening, kind words to my students, modeling love of learning so that they love it, because I want them to grow in knowledge and wisdom, or being friendly to the guy who runs the little neighborhood grocery store, or inviting those kids over into my yard. 90% of love your neighbor for 90% of us is not going on a mission, is not entering into a world hunger program and working on clean water in Haiti. Oh, that's a good thing. Nor is it voting for this candidate or that, but it's love in the everyday life. And that involves self-abnegation. No, that involves yielding, being a gift to others. And by the way, I always say this too, because I've said sometimes tempted to be selfish here, but it's allowing others to give things to you.
Mm.
Well,
Look at that! I gave him a chance for charity.
yeah.
You
Well,
should thank
we're
me.
using we're using the word political here. Now, Richard, you know Aristotle better than I do, of course, but the entire tradition that flows from Aristotle, it seems to me, is everything is in a sense political, the polis, and so politics, broadly defined, simply means here's how we organize ourselves.
That's fair.
And here's the hierarchy of goods and values that help us to organize ourselves. But I know what you mean, though. Right? You were saying that in modern parlance, political has become very truncated, and it's very narrowed to simply the processes of juridical government and electoral processes and so
That's
forth.
That's what I'm thinking of. And by the way, I'm not even sure about Aristotle in this regard.
Well, that's why I asked you about it, because I'd be interested to know what you think.
Yeah.
He starts the ethics by saying it's part of politics. And politics is, he calls it the architectonic science, right? The master science.
Yeah.
But by the end of the ethics, and even in parts of the politics, it begins to look as though there's some goods that transcend anything that the city goes after. Friendship is it perfects justice, but it's not clear that it's and statesmen should encourage it, but what it is seems more personal. And there's something like that in the Republic too. In the Republic, there's a deep friendship between the chief interlocutor with Socrates, Glaucon, and Socrates. And in the end, maybe he's the only one who really gets what that dialogue is about. Glaucon is. He's the one to whom all that talk about the shining good is conducted with. So I was thinking about in terms of modern politics, there's a kind of modesty in the modern state, and this is connected with religious liberty. That we hold short of, well, let's just call it this for the time being, of what some of my friends will call integralism. We hold short of a complete unification for the sake of a kind of liberty, I guess, and intimacy that's connected. Well, it's part of subsidiarity, isn't it? I mean, the highest things in this country, and I think throughout the West to some extent, tend to be between friends and small communities, religious orders, small colleges, in some universities, departments, in some business places, a kind of intimate, like a medium-sized or smallish medium contractor, where the people are in human contact and friendship with each other. I gave parties on the 12th night for years and years, and I invited people who were not Christians, but it was 12th night, and so we sang "We Three Kings," and we had a little prayer service that we did. They were close to me, and I was sharing the faith with them. The text of those things, the text of the carol "We Three Kings" or the prayers, are about higher things than what we could do when I was chairman of the Republican Central Committee. You kind of back off from that a little bit in politics narrowly taken.
But this points to an important thing, I think. You mentioned the modesty of modern government, and as grateful as I am for that modesty, because it does carve out a space of religious freedom, I'm wondering too if there isn't a certain arrogance embedded in that modesty, because frankly, the American government, let's use them as an example, the limiting principle of that modesty is a principle defined by the government itself. The government does not recognize any principle essentially outside of itself as a natural break against its own hegemonic power. And so religious freedom is simply a juridical thing that our government has decided, well, we're going to grant this because it's rooted in some kind of right or something or other. But there's no recognition of the fact that the church has a certain natural authority to it that the state simply has no juridical authority over. So I don't know. I'm not making myself entirely clear, but
No,
what I'm arguing for is that these mediating institutions that you were talking about so eloquently before, Richard, do not simply exist in virtue of governmental largesse. They exist by natural right, and therefore the limiting principle of that government modesty is outside of the government, not inside of it.
Certainly outside the actual people who administer it and the particular laws. That's true. And yet our government does pay homage to it. You know, why is "In God We Trust" on the money? Or why does the Great Seal have Great Seal? It has this Anuit Chaptis. He has nodded upon our beginning. That he, it's Virgil, so it's the king of the gods, Jupiter in Virgil. But they chose that because they were acknowledging the divine authority. Now, the thing is, it's a religiously diverse polity. So it can't do it in a formally Catholic or Orthodox or you name it way. You know, it's not Church of England or any of that.
Right. It can't be that.
It can't be that. But
and that's the problem, right? That's the problem.
Well, that's the situation. And we give public acknowledgement to it, or used to, as best we can, given who we are. I think that shouldn't be minimized. There's a kind of deep sentimental piety that crosses party lines. You know, after 9/11, the congressmen all gathered on the steps of the Capitol. They sang "God Bless America." Now, I know that might just be sentiment, but there was Nancy Pelosi and whoever was the speaker at the time. I forget the other one. And those days it was a Republican speaker, right? Anyway, it doesn't matter. All those old geezers.
Hestert? Was it Hestert?
Say it again.
Was it Hestert? Was the Speaker of the House, perhaps?
Might have been Eckert. Anyway, Moss Meeks, right?
Danny Hestert. Anyway,
we were taught those songs in grammar school. Our Father's God, to thee, author of liberty, to thee we sing. You ought to look at all four verses of America the Beautiful. The last verse is apocalyptic. It's beautiful for patriots.
Yeah, it's true. All of that is true. But you know, some would argue, and I'm sympathetic to it, that a lot of that is the residual effects of a kind of de facto establishment of religion in the United States, which was a kind of pan-Protestant vision of things that had a cultural effect. Then you get the second disestablishment of religion basically in the 20th century, where for the first time you see a rise of a radical notion of a radical separation of churches. People tend to forget that the Jeffersonian idea of a wall of separation was not well received by the Danbury Baptists to whom the letter was addressed. You know, but anyway, we're kind of straying a bit into deeper waters of Americanism.
Yeah, I've kept you all here for 2 hours, so I'll just give you a chance to make any closing remarks you want. And then anyone who's not dying to go, I might go ahead and open it up and let some of the folks from our audience come in and ask questions. But I'm not going to hold anybody past the 2 hour. I promise to keep it to 2 hours. So anybody who needs to go or wants to go, you're free to go. But I'll go ahead and let you all make closing remarks first, starting with Larry.
Yeah, I really do. I have to go. So I just want to thank you. I mean, I don't have a whole many closing remarks today. I thought this was a great conversation. It's finally great to meet Laura and Richard. In particular, I've met Jordan before online. I think it's an important conversation. We've obviously strayed into a lot of different topics, and yet somehow they're all tangentially related to this question of social teaching of the church and whether or not Jordan Peterson is a mensch or not. We'll leave that, you know.
My wife is Jewish, so I'll have to ask her. She'd be the expert witness.
Yeah. All right. So, but thank you.
I said plenty. I do have to go too.
Thank you for joining on such short notice, Richard. Thank you.
Well,
yeah.
I could stick around, so maybe I don't have to give a closing statement.
Okay.
I also have to go, and I've also said way too much, but I appreciate you all. Thank you, Nate, for inviting us. Good to meet you, Richard and Laura. I think the last thing I'd leave with is something that captivated me before I came Catholic, and I visited Rome on a different trip. And it kind of catches to me what I think is the complexity and the bigger picture of at least Catholicism that then, like, you know, these tweets and stuff can get at. And it's at St. Lateran, you know, the facade there, the massive, huge columns there, and you got the 12 apostles on top, these huge statues. And it's a beautiful church, St. Lateran, you know, John Lateran there. But right across the sort of plaza or the circle there, you have at the same time facing the facade a statue of St. Francis. And he's like got his arms up like this. I took a picture of it. I remember doing it. I was like a young 20-something-year-old. I wasn't Catholic. I wasn't planning on becoming Catholic, but I was like, this is really interesting, this kind of dynamic. You've got, you know, St. Francis here, almost like begging the face of, as you might call, ecclesiastical power. And I think that is the dynamic, and both are at play almost all the time in the kind of deep, the riches of the Catholic tradition. That has ramifications for how we think about society, you know, social justice, politics, and so forth. And I think that is the dynamism that, yes, creates, I think, good conversation and stuff. And we've represented some of that here, but it's also kind of the beauty of it, and it continues. And I think that's something that's at least worth. It's a picture for me that kind of crystallizes what I find appealing about the Catholic social tradition, even though there's still much to talk about and much to think about.
Thank you all for joining me. For those of you who needed to go, there's a little leave studio button with a red X. If you hit that, like, you just drop right out. And thank you very much.
All right, so now it's the Nate.
Should be on the Richard. It should be on the right. It's a red X. Okay.
I'm not good at.
It's okay. Thank you so much, Richard. You were delightful to speak with. Thank you for joining us on short notice. I think you enriched the conversation with your presence. Thank you, sir.
Definitely. Thank you.
Bless you too, Laura.
Yeah.
So Nate, do you think we could get Dominic to hop on? He was in the chat.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and drop the invite for Dominic or anybody else who wants to come and join us. Here we go. And we'll just do like if you want to do a post-mortem really quick.
Yeah, that was a good
like your impressions.
It was very good. Was there anything we didn't cover that you would have liked to cover?
Well, I mean, my primary goal was to discipline myself to keep my mouth shut as much as possible.
So there's one issue that I feel like maybe we didn't cover, which is that language per se keeps coming up.
Yeah, Richard brought it up a few times.
That's true, he did, but there was a really specific issue of whether Catholics should be using the term social justice, and if so, how. That several people in this little corner have brought up on various videos now, and I don't know if it's ever been thoroughly addressed.
I did address it. I don't know if you caught the
it came up in your talk with
my talk with Paul, and it's like, my thing is like, no one had a problem with the term social justice until 5 minutes ago. Essentially, like, the phrase social justice has been used for a very long time, and in Catholic circles, and in Christian circles more broadly. And I don't see any reason to just surrender the language of social justice to a particular ideological narrow concern. Mm-hmm. But I do understand, like, the people that have the sense that it's been so tainted that they don't even want to use it. Richard makes an excellent point that, and I actually made this point myself in the conversation with Paul, that justice is inherently social. So at a certain level, it is redundant. But it's not really redundant, because when you put the modifier social in front of justice, you're talking about the kinds of things that a single person can't do on their own.
Yeah, and well, what do you think of the people who have said that it's okay for the Pope to say social justice, but he shouldn't write #social justice, or he shouldn't have his minions do it? Do you think that matters?
Like I said, I mean, honestly, I don't think I wouldn't have had that conversation with Paul, and I wouldn't have done this video today if that original tweet was all that came from Jordan. Like that's fine. It was actually the second tweet. And let me make sure I get the language right here. I keep referencing it. But what he said, so here's the first tweet. The first tweet is, there's nothing Christian about social justice. Redemptive salvation is a matter of an individual soul. I don't think that's right, but he's not a Christian and he's definitely not a theologian. So the fact that he doesn't, I think salvation is more complicated than that. I think that's reductive. So I don't necessarily agree with that, but I wouldn't have had a huge problem with it. And
You wouldn't.
Francis's
Problem with
original,
someone saying there's nothing Christian about social justice.
I would have probably just let it slide.
Okay.
I would have disagreed with it, but I wouldn't have been motivated to like do videos about it and have conversations about it.
Yeah.
I would have been like, he's being ignorant. But the thing is that grace and consideration was given to him by a conservative Catholic publication. And in response to the Washington Examiner's piece that was basically Peterson just doesn't understand what Catholic social justice means, and so he should be forgiven for, talking out of turn.
Mm.
His response was, to a conservative Catholic article, authentic social justice, in quotation marks, is antithetical to Christianity. Or excuse me, is not. So that's what, he's quoting the article. Authentic social justice is not antithetical to Christianity, which is what the article said, which is just true, right? There's no question about that. And then he says, first, yes, it is. So he says it is antithetical to Christianity because it is predicated on group rather than individual categorization. Second, we see damn little of, quote, authentic social justice at pontifex and a lot of ideology. So he accuses the Pope of being ideological and not standing for authentic social justice. And then he does, in fact, deny that authentic social justice is a valid concept because it's based too much on group dynamics and not enough on individuals. So that's where I thought, like, okay, now you've gone too far, because like someone has presented to you the case for a non-ideological, authentically Catholic understanding of social justice, and now you're saying you're not okay with that either.
Well,
okay, now I have a problem.
As a Catholic, I had that same problem with the first tweet, because I was like, I was looking at it thinking, wait, do you now think that like you're the spokesman for what Christianity is all about? And you're going to be clapping back at the Pope on Twitter telling him, no, I'm the one who could explain it.
Well, it also ties to the previous conversation we had. Like, so we had two conversations together about Jordan, one which is very, heaped a lot of praise on him.
Yeah.
Jordan Peterson's harrowing hell conversation.
Yeah.
And then in response to like one of your friends who had some critiques to make, we did the conversation about Jordan Peterson and his like growing association with the political right. And I think that tweet kind of like validated some of the concerns that we expressed of the direction you might be heading in that video, because it's hard. And the fact that occurred at the same time that Trump was making that vengeance thing, it's like that made it particularly salient to me. It's like, what's going on here? And I'm not suggesting that Peterson was being an intentionally malevolent actor. It's not what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting that Peterson might have got possessed by something, just like we all can.
Yeah.
And in a moment, it said something really ill-advised on Twitter that might have repercussions beyond what he intended.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, you have some interesting comments here.
Okay.
AC's most recent comment. Maybe you want to put that up.
The most recent one? Okay. That's an issue with Peterson, but it's pedantic to focus on that rather than the Pope, the politics of. Yeah, I think honestly, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to be blunt with you, AC. I don't think conservatives understand the Pope. I think that like American conservatives who are right liberals, they misread everything that the Pope says that's critical of liberalism as somehow ideological against them. And I don't think that's the correct way of reading Pope Francis. Now, do progressive journalists sometimes quote him out of context and make him seem like a progressive champion? Yes. But I don't think that's what he actually is. I think he's a pretty standardly Catholic Pope. But I'm not a Catholic, so Laura, what do you think?
That tends to be what I say, although I do realize that there are some legit very serious criticisms that can be made of him. I just don't tend to pay a lot of attention to that stuff because I know from my past self that it can really mess me up, just being angry all the time about like church news,
Right.
So for me personally, I just focus on, I try to focus like more on prayer than about like what keeping track than keeping track of what Pope Francis is up to. But definitely if you're in a mood to make a list of all the things he could be critiqued for, you could come up with a long list of some pretty serious problems.
What's the most disconcerting thing to me? I'll tell you. Let me tell you the thing I don't understand as a non-Catholic, but somebody who has a lot of Catholic sympathies, and there's a lot of. I mean, there are a lot of my theology is very Catholic in many ways.
Yeah.
And I would say, for me personally, I have more problems with Vatican I than Vatican II.
Mm-hmm.
So trad Catholics are upset about Vatican II all the time. As an Anglican, I have more problem with Vatican I than I do with Vatican II. I see the Pope as trying to be ecumenical. And I know, like, sometimes conservative Catholics aren't very fond of ecumenicism. So there can be a critique of ecumenicism itself.
Yes.
I think that's a good thing. I think that Christian unity is something we're striving toward. I don't think that it's something that we should ever give up on. And I commend that. But the thing that I'm most critical of him is I do not understand. It's like, if you have political differences around ecumenicism with traditional Catholics, that's fine. But why the war on the traditional Latin Mass?
Mm-hmm.
I just don't get that. It's strategically stupid.
I agree that it's strategically stupid. I think I understand a big part of what's motivating him, but I think he picked the wrong strategy for dealing with a problem that he perceives. Yeah.
Tell me about it. What do you think?
Oh. Well, I don't know. Do you ever look at Angry Trad Catholic YouTube?
I have in the past. I try to avoid it, but yeah, I've seen some of it. Yeah.
Yeah, like Taylor Marshall.
Taylor Marshall, I've seen. Yeah.
Right. There's a spirit there that is not really helping anyone grow closer to God.
Right.
And there's a spirit of division for sure. There's a lot of freaking out about the hierarchy, and sometimes the hierarchy does stuff that is scandalous and worth freaking out about, but there may be an excessive eagerness to freak out about the hierarchy and what they're all up to, right?
Yeah, but I understand that. I get that, and I know that's what it is a reaction to, but it's still a strategical error because I am favorably disposed toward a lot of traditional Catholics, obviously, because I spent some time at Thomas Aquinas College. I know some of them, and we just had like someone who definitely would fall into the traditional Catholic category, like on this panel for this conversation. Mm-hmm. And it's like, you're like, people that are traditional Catholics that are very, very Catholic and completely reasonable are also being harmed by that.
For sure. Well, Slacarius has written a little meta comment here that basically sums up the whole problem, maybe.
Yeah. No, that's very true. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So that element exists in the world of people who love the traditional Latin Mass, but obviously not everyone who loves the Latin Mass is like that.
No. Yeah.
Are there some things Pope Francis would like to do that are less than good, and the more traditionalist Catholics are right to call him out on it? Probably yes. But anyway, if you are Pope Francis and you're looking at the sort of trad world, I think maybe there's a fear that these people are creating too much division, and they're extremely, not all of them, but they're a contingent of them are extremely focused on criticizing me all the time, right? I mean, if you're actually Pope Francis looking at
Well,
things
yeah,
like-
and also there
so
seems to be a
maybe-
certain, I don't know, there seems to be a bit of dispensationalist theology that's kind of seeped into that group too. It doesn't seem very Catholic.
Explain that.
And I can see that coming up in the comments too. Just kind of like concerns of like ecumenicism being confused with some sort of move toward antichrist one world religion, which I can see that kind of comment
Okay.
and you do hear that kind of thing coming from certain trad Catholic circles, which is it's not a Catholic thing, folks. That's Protestant dispensationalism seeping in from American culture, seeping into Catholicism.
So one of the reasons it's hard for me to talk about this stuff is, Nate, how I told you to watch that movie Ancon.
Mm-hmm.
Right. When I try to talk about these things, there's always a doubt in the back of my mind that I actually know what's going on. Right. I read things in the news and I see statements and I hear gossip, and then maybe I have an opinion on it. But if someone asks me to come out on YouTube and make declarations about it, I'm always also thinking, well, I don't know Pope Francis. I spend no time in the Vatican whatsoever. I don't know any bishops. I hear that Pope Francis does things and says things, but it's all filtered to me through other sources. So
Right.
I'm not confident that I know what's going on.
Right,
to the
because
extent that I can comment accurately.
right,
on
it's the same. And right, so we have. I think that's a good point. That's an excellent point, and we have every reason. Just as we have reason to doubt like progressive journalists who are pulling Francis out of context to make him look like a progressive champion, at the same time, we have reason to doubt like right-wing traditional Catholic media that's taking things that he says out of context and portraying him to be what an antichrist sitting on the sea on Peter's sea. I mean, I don't like neither of those things is probably an accurate picture of what Francis is.
Mm-hmm. And so Larry was here earlier. I'd like to ask him about this if he were still here, because he's written a lot about what Pope Francis has done with I think it's the Pontifical Institute on the Family. It was founded by John Paul II, and apparently he kind of gutted it or put different people in prominent positions, and it looks to observers as if his goal is to turn it into a different kind of institution that supports different kinds of teachings that aren't in line with traditional Catholic moral teaching. If that is indeed the case, I think that's something that's worthy of criticism. But again, I don't see myself as having the expertise to say for sure what's going on there,
So this is just like, AC globalism is an antichrist move, and like where is your inspiration for saying that? Like what tradition is that coming out of? What's informing that, and what do you mean exactly by what do you mean exactly by globalism, and what do you mean exactly by antichrist? And I'm not saying, and I'm not complete. By the way, this is not to say that I'm completely unsympathetic to what you're saying, because I would say that certainly I'll be more specific. I'll be hyper specific. I would say that the anti-population or the population control orientation of the WEF is certainly an anti-Christian spirit. That is a problem. But does that mean that like global free trade is antichrist? Is it not good for countries to trade with each other and form trade relations instead of engaging in warfare? Are all aspects of globalism part of antichrist? I mean, it's just too much of a blanket statement.
Well, yeah, I mean, globalism can also happen naturally in a sense. Like nobody has to be planning it. It happens as technology advances and we all come into more contact with each other,
But we're coming into less contact with each other, as we were kept pointing out, right? So
well,
theoretically, our
true
ability
in a sense, yeah.
our ability to be in contact is greater than ever. In some sense, because
I just mean that if it's easy for me to communicate with someone in China, then
it's
easy for us to collaborate on an economic project or something, right? And then things converge just naturally,
Yeah. and that's not. I don't think we want to. The idea of like free trade is not. I wouldn't say that that's diabolical. So it's complicated, but definitely, like, yeah, there some nefarious actors out there that are putting out terrible ideas into the culture on a large scale that's infecting leaders in multiple nations. And is that a thing to be concerned about? Yeah, absolutely. And I think here's the thing, and I think Peterson's idea of forming his arc to oppose that is a good thing. Here's the problem. The way he went about doing it is like, if you look at who we got, it's like, it's just a bunch of right liberals talking to right liberals. There are lots of people who, as should come out of this conversation, there are a lot of people who, for very Christian reasons, would be opposed to that kind of WF agenda, who are not right liberals politically.
Yeah. So who would you want to see be involved in a project like that?
He should, at the very least, from within the conservative sphere, he needs to involve post-liberal thinkers. And so I would like to see him, like, why not invite somebody like D.C. Schindler, who wrote The Politics of Virtue, or he's basing it in the UK. Like, why doesn't he invite John Milbank? You know, or Adrian Pabst or Philip Blond or somebody like that in the UK, who's, you know, and it might be impossible for him to get a leftist who would be a sincere leftist who would be on board at this point.
Probably,
but at the very least, he could involve some conservatives who are not economic liberals.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm reading comments. I don't understand the part about needing pagan cartoons to reinstate Christianity.
It has to do. I don't know. Probably. I think it has to do with. I'm not sure. Pagan cartoons. I'm not sure that's a reference.
Explain, AC.
Yeah. Is he talking about? I don't know what he's talking about, actually. I do know that, like, Lewis. I don't know. Lewis remarked at one point. I don't remember where, but Lewis once said that we might have to become pagan again before we can be Christian.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, I agree. So AC is talking about Jung. I agree that Jung is not consistent with Christianity. Like, there are some insights to be taken from him, but there are problems as well.
Well, and I don't think that Peterson is consistent with Christianity either. He is consistent with a version of Christianity that he finds compelling, but he's not committed to Christ.
No, not that we know of. Yeah. We needed Jung in cartoons through Peterson to even make a case for cleaning your room or for religion itself. What are the cartoons?
Yeah, I don't know.
Oh, am I familiar? Whoa, Oswald Spengler. Hi, Oswald Spengler. How you doing?
Yeah, it was just. Are you familiar?
I'm actually really interested in Spengler. You know that because we
I know that. I know. I knew the name would catch your attention. Hey.
Anyway, sorry. So, am I familiar with the anti-vax Catholic prophet McGill? No, I am not.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with him either.
Erzähl uns mehr, Oswald Spengler.
Oh, is the cartoon? Is it Pinocchio? Is that the? Well, I mean, Pinocchio.
Oh, as in Peterson talks about cartoons in his lectures.
Okay, well, I think that Pinocchio is profoundly Christian, though.
Yeah.
I think, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's very Christian, and the recent Guillermo del Toro version was even more explicitly so. So, yeah, I'm not.
Spengler's the antidote to Peterson.
Okay, now that one you can't address.
That's really interesting. He has a kind of serene pessimism. That, I think, is why I'm attracted to him. Because I am basically also pessimistic, and I like the serenity, because you can be pessimistic and freaked out all the time and tearing your hair out. Or you can just be like, This is how it has to be.
Yeah, that's because
now
I
we
think,
just need to know our options and act
right.
within our
So I
options.
think that's like, so this is one of the reasons I think that he needs to be talking to people who aren't liberals, right? In the class, in the economic sense, because liberals tend to be optimistic and progressive, like all liberals, progressives and so-called conservatives, right? Liberals are still progressive, like in the grand scheme of things. Like they still believe in Peterson is progressive in this sense. He believes that that liberalism will allow technology to solve all of our problems if we just let liberalism do its thing.
You.
And you said your immediate reaction to that was "ooh," right? And he's not right. So, and he's not talking to anybody who's really going to fundamentally challenge that.
Yeah. I guess
So his
not.
actually, he just
does Peterson ever talk to people like Paul Kingsnorth?
No.
No. Maybe they should talk. I don't know.
I mean, Peugeot has talked to Kingsnorth.
Yeah, well, Peugeot wouldn't have that. The Peugeot talks to Peterson all the time, and he doesn't have
the Peugeot is actually the one person who I think has like a Peugeot is not a liberal.
No,
he's definitely a traditionalist
for sure.
So he's
like
and
also a person conservative. Who I think Peugeot has a certain kind of pessimism as well.
And I think he fundamentally just has faith in Peterson as a good actor, as a good operator. So I think Peugeot wants to support him even if he doesn't agree necessarily with Peterson's entire. So
Peugeot has the kind of long-term hope where you think everything's going to come out okay in the end because God is in control of history. But I think he foresees bad times ahead and doesn't think there's a technocratic fix for it.
That does not surprise me that Kingsnorth is not fond of Peterson.
Yeah, makes sense.
That does make sense a lot. Well, I mean, he's not a liberal, and I'm talking about economic liberalism here. And so Peterson is, and that's where and that's why he's mad at. This is at the root of why he's mad at the Pope.
Right? Wait, of why Peterson's mad at the Pope?
Yeah, this is what his allegiance to liberalism. Because the original quote was like about labor and economic stuff.
Yeah.
So he reads any critique of liberalism as crypto-Marxist, even though Christianity has critiques of liberalism that long predate Marxism and have nothing to do with Marxism. And I want to play devil's advocate for the liberals for a second here.
Wait, we got to clear up something for Philip.
Okay.
He says if your main view of Kingsnorth is he's a liberal, you're seeing and hearing something I don't see. No, I don't think we said.
No, I'm saying he's not a liberal.
No, we were saying Peterson's a liberal.
Peterson is a liberal.
Yeah.
Kingsnorth is definitely not. And I think that. So let me make the liberal case for a second here. Make the liberal case for a second here, and it has to do with plenitude, right? If I think that this is almost the case for the prosperity gospel having like this tiny kernel of truth to it too. It's like Jesus like performs these miracles with like the loaves and the fishes and the walking on water, and kind of shows us a way in which our finitude is not as limiting as we think it to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that that in some way, like, we are delusional about our own limitations. And what if we can, in fact, work our way toward post-scarcity?
Yeah. I don't know. It's a good question, but I don't have the answer for you, Nate. I'm still looking at comments.
No, that's fine. I don't have the answer either. I'm
I
just
also
saying.
I
that-
also think there may be people hovering around who would like to talk to me and or would like me to do something.
No
So
problem.
I
All
should
right.
probably go.
Yep.
But
You
this was
bet,
really
Laura.
good.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It was a wonderful conversation. Thank you for joining, Laura. Hopefully, we get to do this again.
Yeah.
Yep. Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.